God, fucking so much to get set up on this thing. I wonder if it's better if I just do it like Mad Laidlaw. Just record it, do a voiceover of the audio later, quiet setting. How much value does it add for me to do this at the same time? I'm gonna wear this big fucking full face helmet. Which I don't. Alright guys. The XSR900. Should you buy it? Yes, you should. You really should. I'll get right into it, and I'll try to be brief on this one. But I'm guessing that if you found your way here to this video, you probably have some interest in this bike. It's already been out for a couple years now, right? And Revzilla, as usual, has done a pretty thorough and critical review, as they always do, and a bunch of other people have done so as well. And if you tuned into them like I have, you probably have noticed that a lot of the reviews for this bike and the things that they have to say are consistently very positive, right? And why shouldn't they be? You do get a lot with this bike right off the bat. It's got 115 horses, 65 foot-pounds of torque, weighs in at a modest 430 pounds wet. It's got 3 riding modes, it's got traction control. Yeah, it's a pretty good value bike, and you can take my word for it, but this thing, it just moves. There's power everywhere, all over the RPM range. Coming off a full stop, passing on the highway is a breeze. If you're being a hooligan and say you're going like, I don't know, 140 kilometers an hour and want it to get up to 160, you just give it a little bit of throttle and it goes. It's a totally linear response. There's no lag or delay. It just goes. Right? And if you're coming from the cruiser world like I did, like that's when you really feel the difference, to be able to be so responsive and nimble at those high speeds. And if you're in Canada, you could probably pick up this bike used for about 8K, which I think is pretty good for the amount of value you get. And then you have this nice aesthetic packaging. So this bike is in what they call a neo retro styling, where the bike, where that means that it's still modern looking, but it's got this old school charm to it. The XSR900, definitely, it's thick in the right places. It's got some muscular, aggressive profile, but at the same time, especially in this paint scheme, in the brushed aluminum, it's still a classy bike. You know, it's muscular yet classy. I'm gonna call this the Henry Cavill of bikes. And then, you know, you could like study the spec sheet on this all day, coming at from different angles. You got like the Triumph Speed Triple, the Street Triple. You got the XSR900, the FZ09. You got like the Kawasaki Z900. You could spend forever analyzing all of the information and comparing them, but you can always, oops, it's my turn to go. Wasn't paying attention, but you could spend all day analyzing that information, but you can always just distill it down to this. You're getting a high performing machine put together by arguably the most reliable manufacturer out there right now, which is Yamaha, right? And you have a nice aesthetic packaging, all at a good price. If you get it, you should change your mind. Unlikely, but if you do, I bet you'd get your money back or close to on resale. So you have those factors to consider. That's why I think this is a good purchase if you have some interest in it already. But if you're a newer rider, let me just say this, if you're a newer rider looking at this bike, I'm gonna say that this isn't your ideal first bike. I'm gonna go with the conventional wisdom on this one and say you're better off getting a cheaper, probably used, less powered bike for you to learn on. I know it's not what you want to hear, but it's you know, just like accidents and all that stuff are so likely in your first year riding, and it'd be a shame to rough up such a pretty machine. You'd be pretty salty too, I would think, if that were to happen. Yeah, I mean, if finances, however, let me just say this. Let's say if finances aren't a concern for you, right? Or if you just really, really want it, and now your only concern is that you think this might have too much power for you, I would say you should get it. Yeah, I'd say you should get it anyway then. If you're genuinely concerned about the amount of power that this thing puts out, I would say that you believe in this concept of moderation, okay? And in that concern, I think, is the mindset that reflects on someone who can keep this bike within their control. That's in my opinion. I don't know you. Maybe I'm just telling you what you want to hear. But in all seriousness, if you're in that position, right, and this is what you want, this is how you do it. You keep this thing in B mode, all right, the lowest power setting. You keep it in B mode with full traction control on. You do that for your first riding season, not negotiable. Like, you do that in the tameness settings. You really get familiar with your riding. You apply your schooling and all that. And at the start of the second season, you do the same, right? You're gonna be a little bit rusty, get familiar with the mechanics of riding and the bike again, and maybe halfway through the second season, if you're comfortable, you kick it up into standard mode. And in standard mode, you should always keep this traction control on full for the first 2-3 seasons at least. Under these conditions, this bike is not gonna flip out underneath you. The front end's not gonna come up. You will be fine, okay? So the bottom line would be that although it's not ideal, I do believe that you can start and learn on this bike. I started on a used Yamaha Bolt, so that's like a 540 pound cruiser pushing 50 horsepower, and going from that to this was like a huge difference, but in the end it was totally manageable, you know. I didn't really feel like there was a massive learning curve or anything like that, but then again, I am more of a tamer rider. I'm not out there trying to drag knees or anything like that at any point. Alternatively, you can also be looking at the XSR900. I didn't have that option when I was looking at the 900. It wasn't in Canada at that point. Sorry, I'm just making sure people crossing. But yeah, the XSR900, and I'll be honest, from certain angles, like, I actually think that might even be the better looking bike. It's a little bit slimmer, it tapers nicely at some places. Definitely a contender, and it's less powered, so it'd be less of a gap for you to get onto than, say, the XSR900. If I had a choice between the two, if I could go back and I was presented with the option of the 700 and 900, I would still stick with the 900. I mean, these are relatively cheaper bikes for good value, but to me, it's still, at the end of the day, it's like still a serious amount of dough. And I think I would be better off spending off the extra few bucks for what I think would keep me happier in the long term. Not just like the extra power, but the riding modes and the traction control, because those features aren't included in the XSR900. So overall, with all the nice things that they have to say about this bike out there, I'm gonna say it checks out. For most of you, myself included, this is pretty much an end game bike or a forever bike, whatever you want to call it, unless you have aspirations to track, you know, and really utilize a 200 horsepower bike someday, like an R1 or something like that. I'd say that this has enough power, but not only enough power, but versatility, which is important. Both power and enough versatility to keep you satisfied to the end of your riding days. And even with all that power that they always emphasize in these reviews, I like to highlight that it's totally manageable, especially if you start applying the riding modes. Like, I do a lot of city riding, intersection to intersection, as you can see. Just around town, short commutes. B mode is totally appropriate for that. And what I like is that you can still pull on the throttle in B mode and stay within reasonable speeds, which makes for a fun ride. Last thing you want is like a bike that's so powerful that you barely get to use because the throttle is so sensitive. You don't get that with this unless you want it to and flip into another riding mode. So I'm in breathe mode pretty often, and when traffic starts clearing up, right, and if I'm going to go on the highway, then I'll flip it into standard mode. And as you know, this bike is very highway competent, which I like. I've messed around on A mode a bit, try again once in a while. I don't really think I have a place for it in my style of riding. It is super sensitive and aggressive. The only time I can think of it is if I'm going on a really long highway ride and I know the route pretty well. But I would say 90% of the time I am in either standard or B mode, and that suits my needs just fine. Another thing I like about this is that when you're stopped at an intersection and it's idling, it's got like little to no rumble, pretty much no rumble whatsoever. It just sits there quietly purring, well behaved, which is a plus. And if you're, let's say like you're really considering purchasing a bike, if not the XSR900, and you're kind of flexible with what you're looking for right now, if you haven't already, I'd recommend that you spend some time like looking into these things called inline threes or triples engines. They sit somewhere between like torquey V-twins like Harleys and sporty inline fours that you commonly see in sport bikes. And I've heard them described as the jack of all trades, which I tend to agree, but then it kind of implies that they don't excel at anything. As you know, jack of all trades, master of none. At least with the XSR900, I'm going to say that it is like a jack of all trades, but it's highly adept at everything. You know, you get that sport bike, you definitely get that sport bike feel. Like I've ridden Gixxers and all that, which is good. Like you get that sport bike feel without committing to the aggressive riding position. And then you don't quite get like that V-twin torque like on like a big twin Harley, but this bike definitely picks up what you want it to. It does a lot of those things really well, and you get a very well-rounded experience on this bike. Yeah, that would be like my take on the power aspect of it. In terms of comfort, and I don't think this gets mentioned enough on the topic of this bike is surprisingly comfortable. I didn't think a sportier bike like this could really compete with like the comforts of a cruiser, which is where I'm coming from. But I'm going to say that this bike is at least, if not more comfortable than, say, the Yamaha Bolt or some of the Harleys that I've ridden, which is really nice. And a part of that comfort has to do with the actual seat. I don't know if you've felt the seat, but I remember when I felt the seat in the showroom before swinging a leg over it, I thought, oh, I don't know about you, seat. You seem a little bit stiff. Seem like you might be a pain in the ass later for me. But no, this seat surprised me. For a stock seat, this definitely exceeded my expectations. So much so that after 8,000 kilometers, I have zero inclination to upgrade to an aftermarket seat and put money into it. This does just fine. Could be that the profile of my bike just happens to fit this seat perfectly, but I don't know, it'd surprise you if you give it a try. Another factor contributing to the comfort of this bike is the ergonomics. Now this is going to vary quite a bit, obviously, depending on your height. I'm 5'10", right? And this bike feels just right. The foot controls are at mids, so they're directly beneath me. They're not kicked out like a sport bike. The handlebars, conservative styling, they're not slammed, although you can get them that way if you're into that kind of thing. And the way it's set up stock and at my height makes for a nice rider triangle. Like I've done multi-hour rides. Never once have I felt my butt feel like it's getting tired, or parts of my body like my neck or shoulders or parts of my back are getting strained from being in that position too long. I haven't had that experience yet, which is really quite fortunate. Now, if you're considering buying a bike, this bike or a similar one thing that might help you is this little comparison sheet that I put together. I used a similar thing before going with the purchase of this bike. I'll put it up here. You can pause it and take a look at it. It's nothing too crazy. Basically, it's just this bike, other similar makes and models with some of the major factors that you look at a bike, like obviously the price, it'll be in Canadian dollars. Maybe like the horsepower it puts out, the torque, its weight, whether it's got riding modes, traction control, ABS, that kind of thing. So I'll put it up. You can pause it, take a look at it. If it's useful, great. If not, you can just move right along. If you wanted to get a better look of the actual spreadsheet, then I'll put a link of it below and you can take a look at it on your own time. Okay? And of all the good things that they have to say about this bike, right, there definitely are some cons. Okay? I'll start with the seat. Now, you just heard me go on about how much I like this seat. I don't have beef with the seat. More so where it's located. This seat is high off the ground. Okay, fellas, like I said, I'm 5'10". Ladies, I'm 6'1", and I just barely flat foot this thing, like just barely. I don't have a problem putting one foot down at the light or anything like that, but when I'm backing this thing up, and sometimes, especially when I discover that I'm working against a bit of a gradient, then that becomes a bit challenging. And if you live in a hilly area like I do in Vancouver, like that'll catch you once in a while. And of course, yeah, you can like adjust the suspension and the seating a bit, right? But if you're significantly shorter than 5'10", this might actually be a deal breaker for you. Or at the very least, it's a consider that you seriously want to put some thought into before pulling the trigger. Now, so presumably you're at home taking this information in, so if you want like a bit of a quick comparative gauge of whether or not you're compatible with this bike, take a look at the length of your jeans, like what is the length of your Levi's, and try to visualize that against this bike having its seat 32.7 inches off the ground. Another thing about having a high seat that I like, on one hand I like having a high seat, especially on this bike, because it's so high off the ground and the way it's styled, the profile of the actual bike never really enters my line of vision. Like I get this really commanding view of the entire scene around me. You might not be able to see it like I do because I have the camera strapped to my chest, but from my actual point of view, which is higher up, yeah, the bike doesn't really come into my line of vision, and I get this unobstructed view of the road and all the scenes that I take in, which I really, really like. I've ridden a few bikes, and I have to say this has so far been a unique experience only to this bike so far. And also, if I'm going really fast on this bike, and I can't really actually see the bike beneath me, it kind of feels like I'm flying, which is, I have to say, it's a really cool experience. Underrated. And speaking of underrated, as much as I do like this high seat, now that I've ridden for a little longer and gotten more experience having ridden other bikes, I actually think I kind of like having a low seat too. It's a bit of an underrated experience when you have a low bike. For one, it's kind of cool where you can just drop onto your bike versus climbing up on top of it. And when you're lower to the ground, right, and you're closer to the road passing beneath you, you kind of feel like you're going faster. I mean, it's one thing to be going fast, but it's another to just feel like you're going faster. I don't know. Yeah, maybe this might be just unique to my style of riding, but being low to the ground is underrated. But in the end, I don't really have regrets. Like, I opted for a higher seat because I wanted that extra clearance to corner better. That's where I was at before I made this purchase, and this is exactly what I got. And you can't have it both ways, because you're lower to the ground, you have less clearance, and you're going to be scraping pegs, which isn't a lot of fun either. That brings me to the second con of this bike. Okay? And that is the fuel gauge. So Lemmy at Revzilla talked about this a little bit at length. I want to pull over and show you what I'm talking about in regards to my gripe with this otherwise fantastic display. Let's just stop over here quickly. Like right now I'm kind of tippy-toeing this backup maneuver. Put it in neutral. This fuel gauge here. So with this fuel gauge, you don't really, it's hard to tell how much fuel is in here. These bars don't move in even increments. Like that first bar lasts a while, and then the second and third go quickly, and then the final few bars, like I don't really know what's going on. I mean, it's inconvenient, yes, but it's not really a deal breaker. I'm gonna say it's actually far from a deal breaker, because like the next time you're pulled over and like if you turn off the engine, you can just kind of slosh around the tank and hear how much fuel you have left. And if you have like a routine like Monday to Friday, you generally know when you need to fuel up next. If you want to get a feel for it, you can start using like your second trip meter and whatnot, and use your trip meter to get a feel for how much mileage you get out in your routine. Like I think I get about like 200 to 230 kilometers or so. That would be the approximate mileage that I get. In the end, it is like it is fairly inconvenient, but it is definitely not a deal breaker. But one thing to note,